For just over a year now, I've been selling a tool for grinding the ends of frets into a semi-hemisphere. And I get questions asking us about the tool, so I'm making this video to talk about it. First question is, why would you? Why would you want to grind the end of a fret into a semi-hemisphere? The answer is it feels nice. That's the simple answer. It's very pleasant. There's arguments for and against. Does it increase the amount of fretting area, real estate, or does it decrease? I don't know. Whichever it is, it's very marginal. But it definitely does feel nice. It looks nice too if you do a good job of it. But it's very pleasant for the left hand when playing, especially on the treble side. Guitar making is you go around in circles. You'll you learn how to make a guitar. It doesn't take too long. But then you take your attention and you focus it towards a particular area. It might be, how do I make them sound better? How do I work on the soundboard? What about the back and sides? Your attention shifts around the instrument and you try and improve each area. Fretting, setup, playability is a very important area, obviously. So just because I've been making guitars for 30 odd years doesn't mean that I've cracked it and that I don't have any more to learn. There's always more to learn. A couple of years ago, Michael Bashkin brought out a course with Robbie O'Brien talking about fretting, and I'd bought the earlier Robbie O'Brien course with Kent Everett. It's a really good course. I highly recommend it, and it certainly improved my fretwork greatly just by buying that course and doing what Kent said. Michael brought one out, and I bought that too because there's awesome and more to learn. And Michael covers semi-hemispherical fretting. The important part with semi-hemispherical fretting isn't the fretting, it's the fretboard preparation, which I'm not going to deal with in this video. If you want to learn how to prepare a fretboard properly, whether you do semi-hemispherical fretting or not, I would highly recommend Michael Bashkin's course or Kent Everett's course. They're both excellent. I apologise for the banging outside, it's very windy today. Actually, I combine the two. I combine a little bit of Kent's ideas about how he supports the neck and how he levels the treble side, and then I also use a bit of Michael's ideas too. But Michael was taking each fret, and with a file he was rounding the end over different directions, and then he was sort of polishing it a little bit with a slow rotary buffer. And I just thought, this is incredibly slow. This adds at least a day to the fret job, which is too much. There has to be a quicker way. So I started researching into grinding, tooling for grinding. So I'll grinding metal, and I found a firm who was making something which wasn't. I couldn't use it, but when I got in touch and said, if I give you the specific dimensions of what I want, can you make me something that I can grind fret ends with? And the answer was yes. So I got one. It worked a treat. I got in touch with Michael. Michael's got one. I'll show you it. Here you go. It's heavy is the first thing. It's heavier than it looks. It's steel, as is the arbor, and it has a groove all around the edge, and that groove is just a fraction over 2 mil wide, and it's about 1.5 mil deep, and it's like a round groove, and the whole thing is coated with a diamond abrasive. It's not super coarse, it's about 300, 320 grit, something like that. I've been using mine for a couple of years and it shows no signs of wear whatsoever. It works beautifully. It'll wear eventually, everything does, but it's pretty good. The arbor, you can see, is pretty substantial. This is the heavy duty arbor. This is the standard arbor. You can see it's a lot smaller. Rather than being turned, I think these are probably pressed or extruded somehow or stamped. I don't know how they're made. They're not perfectly round sometimes. You're more inclined to get a vibration off the standard than what you are off the heavy. If you only make a couple of guitars a year and you want to do semi-hemi fretting, just you buy this one, buy the standard one. But if you're like me, you're doing it for a living, or you want the best, get the heavy one. This tool can't be used in a hand drill. People have asked us. You need to use it in a drill press. It's too heavy otherwise. What speed should you run it at? I run mine at 1450 RPM, somewhere around there. If it's 1400, 1500, doesn't matter. But around that sort of speed, which on most drill presses is perfectly possible. Let's talk a little bit about the process. This is the thing that really trips people up, because it's what this tool does is speed things up. What it doesn't do is remove how difficult semi-hemi fretting is. First of all, is fingerboard preparation. That has to be perfect, because you're going to put these frets in and there is no leveling afterwards. If you have to level the frets, you will remove the top of the fret and you'll ruin your nice round end. So you have to be able to prepare a fingerboard so it's perfect, and then you have to be able to install frets so you don't get any unevenness. So the installation has to be perfect and the preparation has to be perfect. And again, the Michael Bashkin course will take you through this. Michael, the way he does it is he glues the frets in, he clamps them up with a caul which is shaped especially to the fretboard. And if you buy the course from Robbie, he'll take you through that. It's very, very clear. If you want to install these things without deviation from what you want it to be, you have to press them in, really. Something I wasn't impressed by for years. I thought, well, what's the point in pressing frets in? I've got a hammer. But if you want these frets to go in perfectly, then pressing is the way to do it. You can either use an arbor press, StewMax, or what I use is the Summit. It's called Summit. It's like Jaws. StewMax do a thing called Jaws. There's a copy of it by Summit. I use that one. They're both going to be good tools. They're both based on mold grips. Let me get it out and show you. So there you go. I fret using this thing up until of course you get over the body joint, and then I either rig something up with my arbor press or I use a hammer for the last few. And then you're going to be using one of these little gizmos to rock the frets to make sure there's nothing high. And if it is high, you're either going to squeeze it down again with this, or you're going to tap it with a hammer. The problem people have is, how do I get the frets so they're all in a straight line? So I look down the edge, I don't see any of this going on. That's the tricky part, and it requires skill and it takes time. There are a few things you can do to make life a little bit easier. You basically do the semi-hemispherical end on the treble side only. So you'd cut all your frets over length. You'd grind a semi-hemisphere with the tool on one end. You'd undercut the tan, if it's a bound fingerboard, on both ends. And you'd install your fret so that your treble side was all in line. And there's a little gizmo I'll show you to help you do that. And you leave your bass side overhanging. You then trim your bass side as you would do on any fret job, and you grind that flush to the edge of the fingerboard. So they're going to be perfect, and if you're careful in your installation on the treble side, they'll be perfect too. So there you go. That's a very simple way. It's I called it semi-hemispherical fret ends. There's a recent video on Instagram. You can see me taking you through that. But what if you don't want to do semi-hemispherical fret ends? What if you want to do both ends? So you've got the nice, smooth semi-hemisphere going all the way down the neck. Well, there's another little trick I can tell you about, which will help you A lot of different sized instruments. Guitars, guitar bazookas, octave mandolins, tenor guitars, 4-string, 6-string, 8-string, 10-string, 12-string, so I make lots of different things. If you just make guitars, it's going to be a lot easier. But what I do is I make a dummy neck, you could call it. Let me take this apart and I'll explain it. This is not a complicated thing to make. And I've got a box in for different types of instruments that I make. So I start off with a rectangular piece of pine. I place it on the edge of my fingerboard and I mark with a pencil where the frets are on this piece of wood. And when this is still square, before I cut it down to the size of the fingerboard, I go onto the bandsaw and I cut with the bandsaw with a fine plate. You don't stress over what size width you want it, so you can push a fret in. If you tip it over, it'll fall out. You're just holding the frets. To stop the frets from falling out, you make a second piece, which is slightly narrower than the first. You just want this so that you can put a fret in it. You see what I've done? I've then tapered this to match the fingerboard, and it is about 0.5 millimeter narrower than the actual fingerboard. I then make a cap piece which is about 3 millimeters narrower than this, and that screws, I put a screw through every few frets, one at either end, a couple in the middle. So first step, you've made this, you're going to cut all your frets over length. Yeah, you do one end of each fret. You do one end on the grinder. You grind it to a semi-hemisphere. You give it a couple of rubs and a bit of wire wool or web racks, and then you buff it. Again, I've got other videos, you can see this. One end. Then you put all those frets in here with the polished end flush with this edge and the other end sticking out. You put your cap on, and then what I usually do against another piece of wood or a straight edge, I just push it up against to make sure that all these little fret ends are flush. They're not below the surface and they're not sticking out, they're flush with this. Then I go onto my big linisher. Having snipped the ends pretty close, I go onto the linisher and I grind the whole lot flush with this surface. So in one go, you've cut all your frets to length. You take your cap off and you take each fret out, and one by one you grind the end round and you polish it, and it's ready to install. Now, it still might be wrong because your fretboard might not be perfectly straight. You're going to have to adjust them one by one. I would suggest you make your fretboard perfectly straight. But there isn't a stage at which you can just stop looking. You have to keep looking to make sure that what you're doing is right. When it comes to install the fret, you use this gizmo. This comes from a piece of aluminium angle. It was 40 mil in this direction, and I think about 10 mil in this direction. I've cut this down to just over 4.5 mil, and that's enough to clip onto the edge of the fingerboard. And this has a tiny offset. I don't know if the camera will pick that up, but we'll give it a try. Is it focusing on my chin or on this? And that's just off the bandsaw, but it measures 0.5 mil, so that every fret end will be set in by 0.5 mil. So between these little gizmos, between this, pressing your frets in, making a dummy fingerboard, you can give yourself a fighting chance of actually making a good job of it. But you still have to, there's no avoiding the skill in this. You're going to have to, if you want to do it, you're going to have to be prepared to learn how to do it properly. But the tool itself, if it'll take hours, it'll certainly take a couple of hours off the job, and that's why I use it. So there we go.